Now, most of us think of mouth and sleep as two separate things, but often the mouth gives us the earliest signs that your sleep might not be as restorative as it should be. And as a dentist, I see how oral signs can sometimes connect to bigger patterns in sleep. And in this video, we'll go through 5 marked signs that could point to disrupted or unstable sleep. And the first one is something you probably won't expect, and that's bleeding gums. Bleeding gums are usually thought of as a dental problem. Too much plaque, early stages of gum disease, and that's true. But what most people don't realize is that gums can also act as a window into the body's overall inflammatory state. And here's where the sleep comes in. So, studies show that poor sleep quality is linked with higher markers of inflammation in the blood, things like C reactive protein and cytokines. And gum tissue is one of the most sensitive places in the body to these changes. So, if your sleep is fragmented or cut short, your body tends to run hot on inflammation, and your gums can be one of the first places that show up through swelling, tenderness, redness, bleeding when you brush. The link also works in reverse. So, active gum disease doesn't just stay in the mouth. It increases systemic inflammation, which can make it harder for the body to get into restorative deep sleep. And some studies even suggest that people with untreated gum disease report more fatigue and poorer sleep quality overall. So, bleeding gums don't just prove that your sleep is broken, but they could be an early clue that your body is carrying more inflammation than it should. And that's what makes this interesting. Because while gums can show what's happening with inflammation, your jaw can tell a very different story about sleep, one that most people completely overlook. And this brings me on to the second sign, which could mean grinding or clenching your teeth at night. And we call that bruxism in dentistry. And this is another mouth sign that could point to unstable sleep. And most people think of grinding as a stress response. And while stress does play a role, sleep studies show there's more going on. And there was even one landmark study in Canada where the researchers wired up people in a sleep lab and tracked their brainwaves, breathing, heart rate, and jaw muscles through the night. And what they found was that the grinding episodes weren't random. Around 80% of them happened just after what was called a micro-arousal, which is a tiny wake up where your brain and body briefly jolt out of deeper sleep. And right before the grinding, the heart rate spiked and the breathing changed. And then the jaw muscles fired. It's almost like the body was reacting to an unstable moment in sleep, and the grinding was part of that reaction. And from a dental perspective, this is why bruxism matters, because over time it can weigh down your enamel, crack fillings, even cause jaw pain. But the bigger picture is what it says about your sleep. If you're grinding, your nights could be fragmented by micro arousals you're not even aware of. And grinding is something you often don't notice until a dentist often points out the wear on your teeth. And sign number 3 is waking up with a dry mouth. And this is one of the most common signs people notice. And it usually points to mouth breathing during sleep. And here's what happens. When you breathe through the mouth, the air is cold and dry, and saliva evaporates much more quickly, and the normal protective balance inside the mouth is lost. Overnight, the pH levels of the mouth drop, and that becomes more acidic, and bacteria that cause the tooth decay and gum inflammation there thrive. And that's why chronic dry mouth isn't just uncomfortable, it increases the risk of cavities, gum disease, and bad breath. And the story doesn't just stop in the mouth. There's also the sleep side in this. So, nasal breathing and oral breathing are very different in how they affect the airway. And when you breathe through your nose, the air is filtered, warmed, and humidified before reaching the lungs. And the nose also produces nitric oxide, which plays a role in opening blood vessels and improving oxygen uptake. All of that makes nasal breathing more efficient. And oral breathing bypasses this entire system. And in a sleep lab study, which I've linked all the studies down below if you want to have a further read for yourself later on, but they found that airway resistance was more than twice as high when people were made to breathe through their mouth compared to their nose. And the difference was big enough that obstructive events, things like pauses and interruptions in breathing, were far more common with mouth breathing. And what this means is simple. Dry mouth isn't just about saliva. It could be your body's way of showing you that your sleep was less efficient, that your airway was more unstable, or the oxygen delivery wasn't just as smooth as it should be. And if that happens night after night, the impact builds up. Dentally, it leaves the enamel unprotected and accelerates gum problems. Physiologically, it fragments sleep and puts more stress on the body. So while dry mouth might seem like a minor thing in the morning, it's actually one of the clearest cues that your sleep may not be working the way it should. And sign number 4 is morning breath. Now, morning breath is something almost all of us would have experienced at some point. And during sleep, what happens is saliva flow naturally decreases and the mouth becomes a little drier and the bacteria produce compounds that cause odor. And in most people, this fades quickly after uh, drinking some water, brushing your teeth, saliva picks up once you wake up. And when the morning breath is persistent, though, and it's usually strong during that day, it suggests an imbalance in the mouth. And that can be linked to reduced saliva, coated tongue, sometimes gum inflammation. And one factor that makes this more likely is mouth breathing at night. So, mouth breathing dries out the tissues, and the bacteria that produce the odor or the bad odor thrive in that environment, showing a clear association between mouth breathing and halitosis, bad breath, especially when the mouth stays for long periods in that state. And there's also the potential sleep angle. Now, mouth breathing has been shown in lab studies to increase resistance to the airway compared to nasal breathing, to make airflow more unstable. And this means that if you're waking up constantly with strong morning breath, it could be a sign that your airway was less efficient overnight and your sleep may be lighter or more fragmented. So while morning breath might feel like just a minor annoyance, if it's persistent, it's worth paying attention to. It could reflect a drier mouth, environment that raises dental risks, and in some cases, it may coincide with less stable sleep. And the fifth thing is snoring. And this is one of the most noticeable signs of disrupted sleep. It happens when the tissues of the airway vibrate as the air passes through the partially narrowed space. And from a dental point of view, we sometimes see the effects of chronic open mouth posture, dryness, irritated tissues at the back of the throat, or indentations along the tongue where it presses against the teeth. And snoring on its own doesn't automatically mean a medical condition. Many people snore occasionally, for example, when they have a cold or after drinking alcohol, but research shows that frequent snoring can be associated with sleep disordered breathing, where the airway becomes unstable and sometimes collapses overnight. And this is important because the same open mouth posture that contributes to snoring also dries out the mouth. It reduces the saliva protection, and that combination can increase the risk of cavities, gum problems, and morning breath, while at the same time making sleep less restorative. So, those are the 5 mouth signs that could point to broken sleep: bleeding gums, grinding, dry mouth, snoring, and bad breath. And they don't prove anything, but together they can be useful clues that your nights aren't as restorative as they should be. And I really hope you got some value out of this video, and thank you for watching.